The sun rose slowly over the vast and untamed plains of the west, its golden rays bathing the land in a soft, warm glow. The sprawling ranch of Tom and Clara Hawthorne lay nestled in the heart of this rugged wilderness. It was here that they had crafted their life, working tirelessly to build something enduring amidst the harshness of the world around them. Tom, a man of few words but immense strength, was known far and wide for his steady determination and quiet resolve. Clara, his beloved wife, was a woman of grace and kindness, cherished by all who knew her for her gentleness and compassion. Together, they were the heart and soul of their small, close-knit community, and their ranch was a sanctuary of peace in a world that often seemed to lack it. The morning had begun like any other. Clara moved through the chores with a quiet ease, humming a soft tune as she scattered grain for the chickens. Her light brown hair shimmered in the sunlight, and her every motion was graceful, yet purposeful, a reflection of the calm serenity of the land. Meanwhile, Tom was in the barn, preparing one of their horses for a trip into town to gather supplies. He called out to Clara, his voice rich with affection. "Anything special you'd like me to bring back?" Clara, lifting her eyes to meet his, offered him a smile that spoke of a love as deep and enduring as the land itself. "Just yourself," she replied softly, her tone warm and full of quiet joy. But their peaceful morning was abruptly shattered by the distant sound of galloping hooves. At first, it was barely noticeable, but it quickly grew louder, more urgent. A moment later, a group of riders emerged over the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. There were 6 of them, their faces weathered and hardened by years of lawlessness. They were members of Colt Weston's notorious gang, a band of outlaws who had been terrorizing the region for months. Tom was the first to spot them, stepping out of the barn just as they neared the edge of the ranch. His heart sank, a heavy weight pressing against his chest as he recognized the leader, Colt Weston himself. The man was tall and wiry, his cruel smile belying the coldness in his eyes. Colt dismounted with a casual ease, his boots kicking up a cloud of dust as he strode toward Tom, his presence looming like a storm. "Morning, rancher," Colt drawled, his voice dripping with menace. "I heard you've been doing well out here. Thought we'd stop by and see if you'd like to make a little contribution." Tom's eyes narrowed, and he planted his feet firmly in the dirt. His voice was steady, though anger flickered beneath his words. "There's nothing here for you, Weston. Leave now and I won't report this to the sheriff." Colt laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed across the ranch. "Oh, I ain't worried about the sheriff, old man. Now why don't you step aside and let us take a look around? Wouldn't want this to get ugly now, would we?" Before Tom could respond, one of the outlaws spotted Clara, emerging from the side of the house. His eyes lit up with malicious intent, and he dismounted quickly, advancing toward her with a predatory grin. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he sneered, his voice laced with disdain. Clara froze, her heart racing as the man drew closer. Her instincts kicked in, but she forced herself to remain calm, masking the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She exchanged a brief glance with Tom, her calm demeanor belying the turmoil that threatened to break free. She had promised herself that she was done with violence, that she would leave that part of her life behind. But it seemed the past she had tried so hard to bury was now resurfacing, and there was no escaping it. "Leave her out of this," Tom said, his voice rising with a raw edge of anger. "She's not involved." Colt raised a hand, silencing his men. His smile was mocking, his voice oozing with control. "Relax, rancher. We're just taking her with us to make sure you cooperate. She'll be safe as long as you do what we say." "No!" Tom shouted, his desperation rising as he lunged forward. But one of the outlaws struck him across the face with the butt of his rifle, sending him crashing to the ground in a heap of dust and blood. Clara's eyes burned with silent fury as she watched her husband fall. She held herself still, her face an unreadable mask. But beneath the calm surface, something fierce and dangerous stirred within her. She knew that revealing her true nature now would only put Tom in greater danger, and so she swallowed her anger, choosing restraint. "Don't hurt him," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I'll go with you." Colt's grin widened, and he tipped his hat to her mockingly. "Smart lady," he said, and gestured for his men to lead her toward one of the horses. As Clara mounted the horse, she turned to glance at Tom. Her heart ached at the sight of him, struggling to his feet, his fists trembling with fury and helplessness. "I'll find you," he called out, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I swear, Clara, I'll bring you back." She offered him a small, reassuring smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "Be safe, Tom," she whispered, and with that, the gang rode off, taking her with them. For several hours, they rode hard, the sun beating down on them as they made their way toward the mountains, where Colt's gang had their hideout. Clara remained silent, her expression inscrutable as she studied the men around her. She observed their every move, how they carried themselves, the way their hands hovered near their weapons, the careless way they spoke of their plans. They were dangerous, yes, but they were also sloppy, and that would be their downfall. When they finally reached the hideout, a dilapidated cabin tucked away in a secluded clearing, Clara was already formulating a plan. She dismounted with the same grace she always carried herself with, her movements smooth and measured, as though she were entirely unaffected by the situation. "Make yourself comfortable, Missy," Colt said with a cruel smirk, gesturing toward a rickety wooden chair inside the cabin. "We'll send a message to your husband soon enough. He's going to pay us a pretty penny to get you back." Clara sat down in the chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap, and surveyed the room with a steady gaze. The gang had no idea who they were dealing with, and before long they would learn the hard way. Chill through the air. The flames of the campfire flickered, casting eerie shadows across her face as the gang members slowly came to their senses, their confusion turning to alarm. Colt was the first to react, pushing himself up from the log, his eyes flashing with disbelief. "What in the hell?" Clara didn't hesitate. Her voice was cold, firm, the calm before the storm. "I said wake up." The firelight flickered as the outlaws scrambled to their feet, disoriented, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. But Clara was already several steps ahead. She kept the revolver trained on Colt, her stance unshaken, her eyes locked on his with an icy intensity. Her calmness was a stark contrast to the chaos erupting around her. "You should have listened to me," Clara said, her voice low but filled with undeniable authority. "You're out of your league, Colt, and now you've made a mistake." Colt, still trying to regain his composure, straightened up, his hand inching toward his own revolver. "You think you can take us all on, lady? You're out of your mind." Clara's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I've taken on worse," she replied, her tone unwavering, "and I'll take you all down if I have to." The other outlaws hesitated, unsure of how to respond. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. Clara's mind was racing, but she was calm, controlled. She wasn't about to let fear control her. She was no longer the helpless rancher's wife they had assumed her to be. As the gang members fumbled for their guns, Clara moved with a swift precision. Her years of living in this unforgiving world had taught her how to survive, how to read the smallest shifts in a person's posture, how to exploit every advantage. The outlaws, disoriented and slow, were no match for her. In a flash, she disarmed the closest man, spinning him around and using his own body as a shield. She turned to the others, her revolver steady in her hand, her eyes sharp. "Drop them," she ordered, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The gang's bravado faltered. Colt's confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by a scowl of disbelief. "You don't scare me, lady," he spat. Clara took a step forward, her presence commanding, her gaze never leaving his. "You should be scared," she said quietly. "You've just underestimated the wrong woman." For a moment time seemed to stand still. The night air, thick with anticipation, was broken only by the crackling of the fire. Clara's grip on the revolver tightened, her fingers steady despite the chaos swirling around her. This was her moment, and she wouldn't let it slip away. Jeb, still bound and gagged inside the cabin, had begun to stir, but Clara's eyes never left Colt. She could feel the power shifting, the dynamic of the situation changing. The outlaws, once so sure of their control, were now on edge, realizing the depth of the mistake they had made. "I'm giving you one chance," Clara said, her voice calm but unwavering. "Stand down, and I'll let you walk away. But if you make one more move, I'll put you down. All of you." The gang members exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado beginning to crack. Clara's resolve was unshakable, and in that moment they realized they were facing something far more dangerous than they had ever expected. Colt swallowed hard, his eyes narrowing as he weighed his options. He knew the woman standing before him wasn't bluffing, but even so, he wasn't ready to surrender just yet. "I don't take orders from anyone," he snarled, his fingers twitching toward his revolver. Clara's eyes locked onto his, the warning in her gaze unmistakable. "You'll take this one if you want to live." The tension in the air was thick, a fragile thread waiting to snap. For a moment, it seemed as if Colt might draw his weapon, but then, to Clara's surprise, he hesitated. It was a brief moment, a split second of indecision, but it was enough. The silence was broken only by the distant howl of the wind, and Clara's voice, as steady as ever, rang out again. "Last chance." Finally, Colt stepped back, his shoulders slumping slightly as his bravado crumbled. The rest of the gang followed suit, their weapons lowering as they realized the game had changed. Clara's gaze never wavered, and in that moment, the night belonged to her. The gang had underestimated her strength, her resolve, and her ability to fight back. They had thought her weak, but they had learned the hard way that beneath her calm exterior was a woman capable of far more than they had imagined. As the outlaws dropped their weapons and knelt before her, Clara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. It wasn't over yet, but it would be soon. But because of the blatant disrespect they showed toward her and Tom. The idea that they thought they could come onto her land and take what they wanted, with no regard for the life they'd built, made her blood run hot. Clara had worked too hard for too long to let someone like Colt Weston think he could just waltz in and steal it all away. "Gold or silver, huh?" she said, her voice as cold as ice. "You think I'm going to just let you walk away with my land because of some map?" She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Colt's. "You made a mistake when you decided my family and my home were nothing more than a target for you." Colt shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to the rest of his men, but he didn't make a move. His pride wouldn't let him. "It's not personal," he repeated, but his words lacked the same conviction they had before. "We needed the money. Simple as that." Clara shook her head slowly, almost pitying him. "You really think this was about money?" Her voice was low, calm, but every word held the weight of years of sacrifice, years of building, and years of survival. "You don't understand what it means to protect what you've earned, what you fought for." The gang remained silent, the fire crackling in the stillness, each man holding his breath, waiting for the next move. Clara was a woman they had never expected. They had assumed they could intimidate her, take what they wanted. But she was no fragile rancher's wife. She was the protector of everything she held dear, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. Clara's gaze swept across the men, her resolve hardening like stone. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice taking on an even sharper edge. "You'll leave my land. You'll never come back, and you'll never harm anyone in this town again. You've caused enough damage as it is." Roy shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Clara and the others. "But what if we don't?" Clara's eyes locked onto his, the calmness in her gaze now replaced with a fierce, unyielding force. "Then you'll regret it. Not just today, but every day after." She turned her focus back to Colt, her voice steady but menacing. "And if you think for a second that you can intimidate me into backing down, you're gravely mistaken." Colt opened his mouth, but he seemed to realize there was nothing left to say. He was defeated. His gang was defeated. Clara had already won. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, as the fire flickered in the night. Clara's eyes remained hard, her revolver steady in her hand. No one moved, and no one dared speak. Her stance was one of unspoken authority, a woman who had seen enough violence to know exactly how to end it. Finally, Colt let out a slow breath. his shoulders slumping in resignation. "All right," he said reluctantly, his voice almost a growl. "We'll go. We don't want any more trouble." Clara's expression softened only slightly, but there was no forgiveness in her gaze. "Make sure you don't come back," she warned, her voice leaving no room for doubt. As the gang slowly rose to their feet and began to gather their things, Clara didn't lower her gun. She kept it trained on them, watching every move they made. She wasn't about to let her guard down, not when she knew they could turn on her in a heartbeat. Colt shot her one last look, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "This ain't over, lady," he muttered as he backed away. Clara's lips curved into a cold smile, but her voice was calm. "It is for you." With that, Colt and his gang disappeared into the night, retreating into the darkness they had come from. Clara stood in the stillness, her heart pounding, but her grip on the revolver never faltered. She had done what she had to do to protect her land, her husband, and her community. As the last of the outlaws disappeared over the horizon, Clara finally allowed herself to breathe. She had faced them, and she had won. "You don't?" His voice was low, but there was a flicker of fear in it, something that hadn't been there before. Clara's calmness was unnerving, and the power she exuded was unlike anything they had expected. The tables had turned, and Colt knew it. "If I don't," Clara said, her tone unwavering, "you'll regret it. All of you will." She took a slow step forward, the revolver still in her steady hand. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but the threat carried with it a deadly promise. "You've made the mistake of thinking you could take something from me. Now you'll see just how badly you underestimated me." The silence that followed was thick with tension. The outlaws shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, wondering if they had made a fatal error. Colt's bravado had completely cracked, and now he was left trying to salvage what little control he had. "You're crazy," he muttered, his eyes darting between Clara and his men. He was hoping, praying that something would happen to shift the power back into his hands. But the more he looked at Clara, the more he realized she wasn't just a woman standing in front of him. She was the Clara West, a name that had haunted the darkest corners of every outlaw's dreams. Clara lowered her gun slightly, her finger still resting just near the trigger. The shift in her posture was subtle, but enough to tell the outlaws that she was ready. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't need to rush. It was clear now. She had them where she wanted them. "Let me remind you," Clara continued, her voice cold and measured, "I didn't choose this life. I didn't want to come back to it. But you forced my hand, and now you'll see the consequences." Colt's eyes narrowed, but his earlier cockiness had dissolved. He was staring into the eyes of a woman who had killed without hesitation, a woman who had walked away from a past drenched in violence and bloodshed, only to be dragged back into it because of his arrogance. "You're not going to make it out of here, West," Colt spat, though his words held less weight than they once did. Clara stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. She was no longer the fearful woman they had thought her to be. "I'm not here for a fight," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "I'm here to end it." The air around them felt heavier, thick with the understanding that there was no way out for them. The gang had not only underestimated her, they had underestimated the sheer force of will that had turned Clara West into a legend. The younger men were visibly rattled now, their bravado gone. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to make a move or surrender to her will. Colt looked at them, his own uncertainty reflected in their eyes, before he slowly raised his hands in defeat. All right, he said, his voice almost defeated. "We're leaving. We won't bother you again." But even as he spoke, there was a part of him that wasn't ready to back down. He had too much pride to just give up without a fight. Clara raised her gun again, aiming it directly at Colt's chest. "Not until I say you're gone," she replied coldly. She held his gaze, and for a long moment, neither moved. Colt knew better than to challenge her now. He could feel the weight of her presence. He was no longer the predator, and he could sense that Clara had already decided his fate. One by one, the outlaws stood up, their heads lowered in shame as they gathered their belongings. their earlier arrogance replaced with fear and respect. They were no longer facing just a rancher's wife. They were facing a woman who had left a bloody trail across the frontier and returned only when she had no choice. "Go," Clara said softly, her voice low but fierce, "and don't come back." Without another word, Colt and his men turned and disappeared into the night, their footsteps heavy with defeat. The fire crackled, but the oppressive weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Clara watched them go, her chest rising and falling slowly, as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She wasn't just a rancher's wife, she was Clara West, and she had reminded them exactly who she was. Breath, the tension in her body finally easing as the weight of the standoff lifted. She had done it. The outlaws were gone, and with them, the threat to her ranch and her life. For now, at least, there was peace. But Clara knew better than to think it was over forever. Men like Colt didn't give up easily. They'd be back, or others would come looking. She turned away from the now empty camp, her mind already working through her next move. The map she'd taken from Colt still sat heavy in her saddlebag, a reminder of the treasure and danger that lay hidden beneath the earth, and the trouble it had caused. Clara wasn't interested in gold or silver, but she knew that others would be, and they would stop at nothing to get it. With the outlaws scattered for now, Clara mounted her horse once again, her resolve hardening. She had to make sure no one ever came looking for that treasure again. She had to destroy the map, destroy any hope of it being found, before it could bring more violence and chaos into her life. The horse's hooves echoed against the earth as Clara rode back toward her ranch. The morning sun was rising higher now, casting a golden light over the plains, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine a future without the constant threat of outlaws and danger. But deep down, Clara knew she would never fully be free from that life. It was always just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface when least expected. When she reached the ranch, she headed straight for the barn. Tom was waiting for her, his worried eyes softening when he saw her ride in. She dismounted and handed him the reins, not bothering to hide the fatigue that had settled over her. "You okay?" Tom asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Clara nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." She paused, glancing toward the horizon where the outlaws had disappeared. "It's not over. They'll be back, or someone else will be. But I'll be ready." Tom studied her for a long moment, his face hardening as he understood the weight of what she was saying. He had seen Clara face danger before, but this felt different. There was a finality in her words, a weariness that spoke of too many battles fought. "What do we do now?" Tom asked, his voice low. Clara looked back at him, the resolve returning to her gaze. "We wait, and when the time comes, we fight again." She glanced down at the map in her bag, feeling the cold reality of the future pressing in on her. "But first, I'm going to make sure this doesn't threaten us again." Clara's grip on the reins tightened as she made her way toward the house. There would be no more hiding from her past, no more pretending that the life she had once walked away from wasn't a part of who she was. She had to destroy the map, and whatever it represented, before it found a way to destroy everything she and Tom had worked for. It was time to finish what she'd started all those years ago. Years passed, and the legend of Clara, Ironshot West, faded into whispers, carried on the winds that blew through the small town where she and Tom had made their home. The ranch had become more than just a place of work. It had become a symbol of the life they had built together, a life grounded in hard work, love, and the quiet strength of two people who had seen the worst the world had to offer and emerged stronger for it. Clara's revolver remained by her side, not out of necessity, but as a quiet reminder of the woman she had been and the battles she had fought. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. The ranch, the peaceful mornings spent with Tom, and the steady rhythm of life had given her a peace she thought was lost forever. But the world had a way of reminding you that peace was a fragile thing, one that had to be fought for, not with guns or violence, but with the quiet, persistent strength of someone who knew what they were worth. Clara had made peace with her past, but she would never forget the lessons it had taught her. And though the world might have moved on from the legend of Ironshot, Clara knew that her story was far from over. She had already defeated one threat to her family's happiness, but there would always be another, lurking in the distance, waiting for a moment of weakness. She didn't fear it, because Clara West had learned something along the way. The fiercest battles were often the ones you fought not with weapons, but with your heart, and that was a battle she would always win.